that's a great segue into another one of your books that is great, Conscious Loving.
Oh,
For
yes, thank
that,
you.
I'm going to bring in my wife Rebecca, who you've mentioned already, and let her take the floor with a few questions. There
Hi.
we go.
Hi, how did he recruit you from California?
Yeah.
We met in London actually. I was working here a few years ago. And when I found out that you had agreed to this interview, I said, I have to talk to him. He's been a highly influential person in my life. So thank you for all the work that you've done in putting your own personal story out there and sharing your own journey, to help people with their own lives. It's made a big difference in mine. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very grateful. That's the best thing you can say to a guy like me.
So I give this book to a lot of my friends. I tell them, there's a quote from Carl Jung where he says, I think something like, if you don't if you don't let your subconscious become conscious, it will rule your life and you'll call it fate.
Yes, that's one of the most, I think I put that out on my Instagram one time as the pithiest quote I've ever heard. It's an absolutely brilliant idea. I don't remember the exact wording, but it's so true. I mean, if you don't process the stuff that's actually running you, then you just think life is happening, and it looks like fate is coming at you from every direction. And yes, well, that's a big piece of, I spend a lot of my time with people rewiring that, so they understand that this is where life is manifesting from, not over there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's sort of how I would describe the central idea behind Conscious Loving, which you co-wrote with your wife, Kathlyn, as I understand.
Yes.
Is that, how would you introduce our James's viewers and listeners to the idea of conscious loving?
Yes, well, conscious loving, we used to, when we were first going around doing lectures and workshops and things, we used to give away this little badge that you wear. It says conscious loving, consider the alternative. So let's consider for the moment what unconscious loving is. Okay, what do people most complain about when they exit a relationship? One is, I never felt appreciated. So conscious loving is having the intention to appreciate the other person, having the conscious intention to give appreciation on a regular, meaningful basis to the other person, which means you find out how they like to be appreciated. You find out more about how you can appreciate them. So it becomes a point of focus in your life. That's conscious loving. Another thing, what do people complain about when they exit a relationship? It's often, he or she didn't ever tell me the truth, especially about the fact that he was having an affair with his secretary, or especially the fact that she was spending money that she wasn't telling me about. Those kinds of things that are in the general subject of integrity in a relationship, having to do with, do you speak honestly to the other person? Do you listen consciously? Or do you try to talk them out of what they're feeling? Or do you try to just argue with what they're saying? See, conscious loving is about speaking consciously and listening consciously, because not very many people do, to be honest about it. That even people that come here for counseling in their relationships, that's a very small part of humanity. There's not that many people that do that. But what I think needs to happen out in the general world is that we need to, especially teaching in schools, the value of transparency and authenticity. Because you see, if you're not transparent with the world, you're hiding in some way. And I always say to my students, and these are all professionals, we don't have, most people come here to our trainings are people that already have a practice of some sort, or already They might be a medical doctor or a psychologist or a therapist or a life coach or something like that, but they are almost always involved in human transformation in some way. And so they're a pretty select group. But even among that group, it's always amazing to me how poorly trained we are in how to communicate the simplest things in relationship. Just how to have a conversation, how to solve a problem without making somebody wrong. Wouldn't that be a great thing if all couples knew how to do that? Because the default position for many couples is to go into blame immediately when a problem comes up. Well, hey, that's not my problem. That's you're the one. And the only thing is the other person never agrees with that point of view. The other person never says, you're right. I am the single cause of all of your life's problems. Darn, I wish I'd thought of that before. We don't look at it like that. We say, wait a minute, who's blaming here? You're the one that's to blame. And so I've literally had couples here that have been having the same argument for 20 or 30 years before we showed them how to stop that argument. And interestingly enough, I've only found one really good way to stop blame. And that is by taking 100% healthy responsibility for whatever the thing is. And if you can get both people to do that, you got yourself a great, thriving relationship, even if they're committed to it, but don't know how to do it well. Katie and I had to, we didn't have a self-help book when we started all this. We had to kind of learn it by the seat of our pants. And so it took us years sometimes to learn things that now, because of people having the books and our e-courses and things, you can learn something in an hour that literally took us a year to learn. So that's one of the great advantages of living in a communication age is it not everybody can afford an expensive trip to Southern California to come here in person. And so I was very happy over the past year because even though there was terrible things going on in the world, our courses, suddenly people all over the world were taking them because we were offering them on Zoom and video and things like that, rather than people having to do them live. And suddenly people are getting up in the middle of the night in Dubai or South Africa or Australia or wherever to take courses that they would have never been able to take before. So that's one of the blessings of the past year, in addition to all the horrors of it.
Mm-hmm. I was glad to hear you mention, education and bringing these concepts into schools, because my next question for you is how, I came into these ideas in my 20s, and I really wished that I knew about the concepts of conscious loving and stuff like attachment theory earlier in my life, because I think it would have saved me a lot of suffering. I wanted to get your thoughts on how to introduce young people to the idea of, conscious, healthy, romantic relationships in an age-appropriate way that gives them the tools to be empowered to have healthy relationships.
Well, there are different ways for different levels of, when you're dealing with latency age kids, elementary school, basically. I don't know how you divide it up over there, but over here, people go to elementary school, and then they go to a middle school, and then go to a secondary school. And high school kids are a real tough crowd, I've found. Elementary school kids are an easy crowd. They get it like that. So we have a thing that our students have created that are into education. It's called the Conscious Kids Curriculum. And you can take a look at it. It's somewhere on our website somewhere. So, but if you do a search for Conscious Kids Curriculum, you'll see the kinds of things that we value teaching in the early stages. But you have to kind of adapt that to different levels of kids learning, because something that a first grader can process easily, interestingly enough, if you take it into a senior high school class, they take forever to process it because they've got so much resistance by then. My wife is a movement therapist. Katie was one of the first original dance movement therapists in the country. And she was telling me that when kids, before they go to school, they have access to several thousand movements But by the time they graduate from high school, they're down to only a few hundred movements that their body can do. So the process of education in one way is a process of becoming stupid in another way, because if we lose 90% of our body movements over a period of sitting in those really comfortable desks for 12 years, I don't know who designed the desks in your school, but I think some kind of a torture expert designed the ones that I sat in as a kid. And so there's a price that we pay, and same thing with communication, that we actually, I mean, if you think of the thousands of words that people could learn, you know, just think of the thousands of new words that Shakespeare put into the language. Well, by the time people get up into adult life, they're down to about 300 words. I mean, so I don't want that to happen. I want to have more access to stuff when I'm 80 than I do now when I'm only 76. You know, I want to keep opening up more and more and accessing more and more of those aspects of myself, and also learning new things. We've found here, we worked with a lot of couples that are midlife and up. Midlife is usually defined as 42 to 55, along in there. And so we work with a lot of couples because we wrote a book called Conscious Loving Ever After that's designed for couples in midlife and beyond. And one of the things we found, I'll just give you a pre-sample of this. One of the things we found is creativity is super important in thriving relationships, both people keeping their creativity flowing. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that Katie and I, you know, we have more fun than I can ever remember us having in our 30s and 40s, you know. And I think it's just because we've lived more life. And like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet says, those who breathe most air live most life, you know. So if you make a commitment to kind of living a big life and, you know, celebrating it every moment you can, I think that's one of the key things in keeping a relationship thriving.
I guess we have one sort of wrap-up question, which is, I think of you as someone who has it all figured out, but paradoxically also is the kind of person who's always working on themselves, always growing. So I wanted to know if there are still things that you are discovering about yourself, about relationships, and epiphanies that you are still having, and maybe what your ongoing practice is like.
Well, yes, I have insights all the time about my own relationships. In fact, this morning I was meditating. Oh, that's another thing I do every day. I meditate twice a day. I learned TM way back 50 years ago, and I've been doing that twice a day ever since, and really value it tremendously, because it's like a little 20-some minute period of time in the morning of getting myself really still before I start working. And then at the end of the day, kind of getting myself, like taking a shower at the end of the day, you know, getting my mind showered up for the evening. But anyway, I was meditating this morning, and I had an insight about something that's going on with my daughter, who's around 50 and lives up in the Bay Area, and about my relationship with her. And so, you know, I think we need to stay open to these things all the time. I want to be learning stuff about my breathing when I take my last one. And so I think, well, here we use a thing, we have a 20-point openness to learning scale we use with executives and that kind of thing. And the higher you can go toward a 10, being very open to just learning from life, not defending yourself. You know, when you can go through life that way, and when you can go into relationship that way, real magic can happen.